Hi everyone, welcome to The Only Way is Ethics, episode 6. I'm here with Leah Parry from University Hospital, Bristol and Weston. Shortly, I'll let Leah introduce herself and tell her a bit about her role and her journey into digital health. I'd just like to say to everyone, you can catch us on Spotify and YouTube. The links will be in the post that go out on this channel. So I'll welcome Leah and thank you ever so much for taking the time to come and speak to us. I'll hand over to you to tell us a bit about yourself.
Thank you for having me. I'm Leah Parry. I'm the CxIO for Nursing, Midwifery and AHPs at the University Hospital, Bristol and Weston. I've been in post for just over a year now. And most people will be familiar with the sort of CNIO role. So that is the role that I fulfill at Bristol. I'm a physiotherapist by background, and I've been working in digital healthcare for nearly 10 years now. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that, Leah. And so, working in digital health for 10 years, that's quite a long time. And I know as part of that journey, you put out a post on LinkedIn the other week, and I had to get to this one, and it spurred us on. We'd already organised getting you in for this episode, but you spoke about sort of the comparisons between you getting your minidisk player. I take it as a sort of like a teenager, and comparing that to digital health technologies. And I think when I was reading it, it was those light bulb moment, and you're absolutely right, and you're absolutely on the money in relation to the comparisons you were making. So yeah, it'd be good to sort of like, where did that come from, and sort of like, what spurred you to put that out?
I don't know really. So anyone that wants to read my blog, it's on LinkedIn. Why I think the NHS is in its mini disc era. I'm a bit of a storyteller, so I'm constantly trying to think of analogies to try and help people that aren't necessarily digitally savvy or kind of know the art of the possible, to try and kind of bring them on the journey. And so I was sort of reflecting back and thinking about digital transformation in areas that it's worked and it's happened, and I sort of was thinking about the music industry and how actually, you think about Spotify streaming. When was the last time anyone bought an album? Probably a very long time ago, unless you're a collector or anything like that. And so it kind of got me thinking about the musical industry and its digital journey. And it made me think of mini disc, because obviously I was only a baby because I'm only 21 now, but I remember being really excited. I had a Discman, and I was really into my music, and I remember getting a mini disc, and actually all of the functionality was absolutely there. It could do some really cool things, some really clever things. Lots more music, better quality sound. I could take what I wanted, record what I wanted. So the actual functionality, if you kind of draw it to digital healthcare, if you were describing requirements, it met a lot of requirements. It did what you wanted ultimately. But then you work out how you get those requirements and how you get the best out of it. And it was really clunky. It took a lot of individual knowledge to know the best way to do things. The actual process was pretty laborious. It took me ages to make my first and last mini disc, because I didn't do it again afterwards. And I guess it rung true with so many of those conversations that you have with clinicians around, okay, the system might do what we want it to, but it's really annoying, and we rely on people knowing how to do things, because actually the intuitiveness and the ease of getting the best out of the system just isn't there yet. And so I sort of drew that analogy to say, if we can get to the MP3 world where it's plain sailing and it's easy for the user, then we'll have then we'll have really achieved something. So at the moment, I think we're in that mini disk era, because the functionality is there with, you know, all of the different EPRs that you can think of. There's a lot of functionality there, but the importance and the emphasis on user experience, usability is somewhat lagging. So I think we've got a lot to do to kind of challenge suppliers, but also really work on how we optimize our workflows and prepare users so that we can get to the MP3 stage in healthcare.
I suppose you're absolutely right, and it's a two-way street, isn't it? But I think from my experience as well, having those 11 years working for on the developer side, working for a manufacturer, and I'm not saying that all manufacturers do themselves any favors by in their approach as well, and sometimes it's that lack of collaboration in relation to sort of like development and sort of like I even find even now sort of like, you know, working with a lot of manufacturers, the lack of user groups that I find in space, and actually sort of like going out talking to the sort of like user community to get their experiences, and like you say, using like that mini disc. And fortunately I didn't fall into that trap. Yeah. I went, yeah, I think I went straight from sort of Walkman to sort of, I was one of those sitting there with the cassette player doing a stop on a Sunday when the charts sort of came up, and sort of like
talk about that in the blog too,
and sort of doing that, and that's in your blog as well, isn't it? So but you're right, there's a lot of stuff out there, isn't there, that's got a lot of potential, a lot of functionality, quite synonymous with sort of like if you look at actual data as well, you know, there's a lot of data out there, but again, it's like, how do you surface that data, and how do you bring that user experience to the users? And importantly, which I think a lot of manufacturers tend to sort of forget about, is that clinical workflow. I keep going on about the digital health system is there to enable the clinical workflow. It shouldn't be the tail wagging the dog in relation to that. That's what happens with some systems. We get overawed, don't we, by sort of like, you know, the amount of functionality. I think sometimes when you get under the bonnet, it's like, okay, it's got a lot of functionality, but what's it actually doing? Is it actually helping us? Is it actually sort of supporting our processes in relation to that? And it does ring true. So keeping that in mind, I mean, you work at sort of University Hospital, Bristol and Weston, so an organisation that's got many systems that you're working with. You've got sort of, you know, a big list of digital health projects in relation to that. So you came in to the organisation 2.5-3 years. 3 years
just
ago
over a
now.
year, just over a year now.
Just over a year. It
feels like longer.
Yeah, it does. It does. And so sort of like, you know, and we've collaborated along that on that journey with you and your team. And so tell us a bit about sort of like, you know, when you came into the organisation, and obviously we you know, it's getting onto that clinical risk management side now. We've you know, a little chat about sort of like the systems and stuff, but you know, if we concentrate now on clinical risk management and your experiences in relation to that, not necessarily just at Bristol and Weston, but your previous role at Gloucester as well.
Yeah, so I think when I got to Bristol, it was very clear that one of the priorities areas that kind of the senior leadership team wanted me to look at was clinical safety, because they'd identified that it was an area that we weren't doing very well at all. We had a couple of really strong advocate champions. Pete Barfield, one of my team that you know and have met many times, was absolutely kind of very siloed in understanding that there was this requirement for us to carry out clinical safety assessments from a clinical system point of view, but beyond that, not many people really understood it. And so in my previous role, I've been involved in kind of clinical safety implementation, and my role at Gloucester was really largely around clinical leadership, but organisational assurance and linking in with the organisation to be really clear about, you know, what we were going live with, what that meant to the organisation, and kind of helping that risk benefit conversation play out a lot of the time. So when I got to Bristol, it was quite clear that we needed to quite quickly create a process that joined up what was a very siloed digital safety process, but that was quite limited, into the organizational safety processes. Because, you know, I feel really strongly about this, in that I think a lot of the time clinical safety officers get quite siloed, work with digital services to tick a bit of a box in terms of, have we done, you know, have we met the compliance, have we done enough to go live? And even then, it's been interpreted in very different ways. You know, the legislation can be interpreted in different ways, and the guidance can be interpreted. So it's very much left to a person normally with a responsibility to tick some boxes and create a report that goes into kind of the project documentation. But, you know, actually what the legislation is there for, and it tries to do, is give the organisation the chance to go, actually, have we done all we need to do as an organisation to get the most out of that product, that system? And I mean, if you look at any of the kind of incidents that have hit the news around digital system implementation and safety issues that have come out of it, very rarely has the product failed. It's more often that the process work and the transformation piece to say, you know, it's very, if you go back to just transformation, it's identifying how are our processes going to change and how are we adapting to use that tool. And often it's that bit that's under-egged, in my experience across kind of transformation, digital in particular. And so I think by linking up the digital safety aspect with the organizational governance, and I hate the word governance and people hate the word governance, but what's the point in carrying out a risk assessment, because that's what clinical safety is, about a tool to assess how do we need to monitor, mitigate the changing risk profile? Because, you know, there are so many risks involved in paper care that it's a no-brainer that digital care, the net benefits are better, safer. We can share information quicker, we can access information quicker, we can see that end-to-end pathway quicker. But actually, the individual implementation and use often requires a change that does sometimes introduce some risk. So how are we as an organisation, you know, if I went to the chief nurse, the chief medical officer, the people that are really accountable for risk, how comfortable would they be talking about digital clinical risk? Or are they relying on the fact, or not even relying on the fact, because sometimes they don't have that kind of connectivity of a clinical safety officer just doing a job? And I think digital will always be siloed if we don't improve that connectivity of actually digital risk is just one of many risks within our portfolio of risks. And that's probably quite dry, Dean.
No, it's not, Leah. I think you're absolutely right. You know, whether it's, you know, like some people say, whether it's dry, boring, restrictive, however you want to look at it in relation to the process, it's there for a reason. You talk about legislation, you talk about, you know what we're talking about, just for the audience, like, you know, DCB 0129 and 160, the NHS safety standards, but it's beyond that as well, isn't it? It's like you say, if you want to bring that alive within an organisation, if you want to make that work, it has to be harmonised, it has to be incorporated within that organisation, and there needs to be a level of awareness at every sort of like level. You talk about siloed as well. We see this so often within health organisations, don't we? The clinical safety officer that is a lone wolf. They are out there on their own. Sometimes they are a person with a great experience, and with a lot of experience within digital health, and possibly within clinical risk management. And
sometimes they've got a job, done an e-learning course, and been told off you go.
Absolutely, and this is it. We're at different levels of the spectrum, aren't we? The landscape is so varied, but I suppose what I'm trying to get to as well is that it doesn't matter whether they're one person with a huge amount of experience or one person with no experience or little experience. If they don't have that support mechanism, if they don't know I don't want to say chain of command, but it is that sort of, where do I go to? Where do I escalate? We were just chatting prior to coming on to this, like to the episode, and you were talking about that sort of, where do I go to when we're all clinicians and within our roles, whether you're AHP, nurse, doctor, and there, that chain that we are taught, it is drummed into us, that whole chain of command, and we know, within our peer groups, and where we need to go to if we have concerns. And I think at the moment, within digital health and within clinical risk management, that's very unclear at the moment at a national level, not just within health organisations. And if it's unclear at a national level, and there doesn't seem to be, going to stick my neck out here and say, there doesn't seem to be that direction from NHS England, then how are health organisations supposed to, where is the steer in relation to that? And it'd be good to get your sort of, because you said about, you came into Bristol and Weston, at Gloucester, you seem to have sort of like, you're setting this process up. There seemed to be that clear process, and then all of a sudden you come into Bristol and Weston, and you almost start again in that respect. And it's like seeing that sort. And I've seen from my time working with you and your team, I've seen that sort of siloed approach grow into, and that a lot of that's thanks to yourself in with that team. And I think one of the takeaways for me, which I go out and promote to other health organisations as well, is around everyone gets very hooked up on this clinical safety officer role, and not the wider team and not the wider skill sets in relation to digital health. And I know that's something that you've sort of you've picked up on, and your guys are digital clinical specialists, which I think is absolutely fantastic, rather than just putting them out there as a CSO role. And it'd be good to get your sort of your take on that.
So I think the clinical safety officer role is obviously, for me it's a function that you need in an organisation. You need people with the skills to carry out that role. I think some organisations have it as a single role, and that's just a different way of doing it, because I would assume that person is then responsible for kind of overseeing the governance across the board and making sure that the organisation is keeping up to date with things. But I think the model that we've got at Bristol, which I like, is that we've got digital clinical specialists that get involved with the transformation, they get involved with the engagement, they go out on the shop floor, so they have that understanding of the clinical system and how it's being used, and they get involved at every stage. So I think that really helps their awareness and their understanding. It also means we've got a larger number of people that have that training and that competence, so we don't mark our own homework. So if you've been involved in the transformation, someone else can come and get involved and be a bit more objective. I think for me, the thing with the CSO role is, let's be clear about what it is, whether it's a role or a function. It's an organisation is required to make sure that some people are suitably trained to be the subject matter experts in digital clinical risk assessment and management. What that doesn't mean, whether you talk about RACEs or accountabilities, responsibilities, what it doesn't mean is that those CSOs have the weight of the digital transformation and the responsibility for doing all that assessment and carrying it on their shoulders. And I see that a lot of the time with that siloed working, is where people think they are carrying that whole assessment and the consequence of that assessment on their shoulder because they have no link into the wider organisation. Whereas the way that we've got our digital clinical risk management system approved at Bristol, and what that does is it says that for every clinical system that we go live with, we need a clinical work stream that will be facilitated by a clinical safety officer. But actually, we need the people that are involved in using the system to carry out the risk assessment. We then need the people that will be helping manage the risk involved so that they know what they're documenting, carrying on, carrying over. And then the CSO will make a recommendation based on their assessment. But that's what it is. It's based on my subject matter expertise. I'm making this recommendation. And it doesn't stop there. So at that point, it then needs to go through the normal kind of organisational process to sign off the governance. So, ultimately, for some of those big, wide trust projects, that goes right up to the chief nurse and the chief medical officer, because ultimately they're responsible for the quality and safety of care. So it's how we join up all those dots so that we get the right people doing the right bit at the right time to make sure that the end point is we're live with a system that we know has some risks, because nothing is without risk, but we're really aware of what they are across the board, and it's not down to just a few people in digital thinking they know the risks, documenting the risks, but then no one else being aware of them and managing them and supporting them.
And I think there's two key points there you mentioned. It's that awareness. And also you mentioned around sort of, everyone, it seems at the moment, doesn't it, that it's very onerous on the CSO. I'd like to get this out there as well, that if people have got this illusion that risk sits with the CSO and they own it, they don't. They don't. I still hear it, unfortunately. I hear it within organisations and within sort of manufacturers as well, that everyone seems to put this onus. And that's a lot of pressure, especially if you've got a CSO that isn't aware that that's the case, or someone that doesn't have the knowledge base. Then obviously you mentioned the organisational process and the organisational governance that has to go through that. I think it poses that question, that if there isn't the awareness at that level, because it's really interesting speaking to Kimberly Dawson on a previous episode, and when she did a talk at Rewire, that was like, clinical risk management, it is clinical safety, it is everybody's job, and posing that question. And I suppose it's trying to, it's that big task, isn't it? And it is a big task. So because standard's been out 16 years now, and I keep, every time I say that to someone, and I'm sick there, and I just think, how have these standards been out 16 years, and we're still talking about raising awareness within the NHS, and there's still pockets, probably big pockets of people that don't know what the standards are, and they work in digital. They work in digital health, and I see it on a daily basis, and people aren't aware. And if we go back to basics, it's harm to patients. This is ultimately, it's all about the patient, and that's where it should be.
There's a few bits in that though, isn't there, Dean? So there's very little done if you don't adhere to the legislation. There isn't a lot of follow-up or consequence at the moment around if you don't. And also, like we said before, the legislation is up for interpretation. So there are different scales of implementing it. And so, some places could say, oh, we've done a very light touch version, and so that's enough. And for me, yes, it's legislative, but for me, it's not about the legislation. I think it's important because if it's done properly, what it does is it guides a really thorough implementation that sets you up to adopt and embed a digital tool that's really going to give you the benefits. Because if you break down the clinical safety process, it's, do we understand our requirements? Do we understand how it's going to be made? Have we tested it well? Have we trained it well? Can we support the go live? What's our mechanism for identifying problems as they arrive on the fly? Like, even if there was no legislation, that to me sounds like a really good process to make sure that whatever we use well and we use safely. And we, not just safety, we really get get the best out of it.
And I think that's the positive. You're absolutely right, and it's not all about the legislation. I think what the standards do, what I've found in my experience, it makes you look at the project holistically.
Mm-hmm.
It forces you to look at process, doesn't it? It forces you to look at, okay, right, scope definition, right, what are our clinical processes? What is our current state and what's our future state? Have we taken all this into consideration? Because it steps you through, doesn't it? It steps you through that process. But what it's doing, it's allowing you within that project to actually look at, get under the bonnet and actually say, you know, and 9 times out of 10, it's a bit of realisation as well, isn't it? It's the organisation saying, or people within that project going, well, actually, yeah, we've got some work to do. But that's fine. That's a positive, isn't it? Because if you weren't to look at that, or you didn't have that standard, or there was no process in place. I know you said like you hate the word governance, etc. and stuff like that. And
it does make the world go round.
It does, unfortunately it does, when you look at it. But you're absolutely right. It just makes people take you just need to take a step back, don't you, sometimes? And actually look and say, okay, what have we got? Where are we at the moment? And what is it that we need to do? And like I say a lot of the times, and sort of like, you know, you've heard me say this a lot of times before, it's not rocket science. You know, we're not talking about sort of like, you know, really intricate sort of like stuff that should take sort of like, a lot of it is, isn't it? Practical pragmatism and common sense, dare I say it, in relation to what we're doing. And I know you sing from the same sort of like hymn sheet in relation to that. Yeah. It's not about over engineering anything that we do in relation to that. So we have mentioned governance on a couple of times, you know, and I know it's that sort of, you know, oh, that dirty word, governance, but you know, and you mentioned the clinical risk management system that you've got signed off as an organisation. It would be absolutely music to my ears if all health organisations within NHS England, within the UK, were in the same position to be able to do that and had that level of understanding. I think we'd be in such a much greater place. And it is a tough one. It is, you know, like I've said before, it's a tough nut to crack. And why do we seem to make it sort of harder for ourselves sometimes, I think, in relation to trying to get this in place? I know a lot of it's to do with raising awareness. I know that I find at a senior level, if there isn't that awareness, and people don't know about clinical risk management, they don't know what they don't know. So we have to teach them, don't we? You know, and doing that at the right level as well. And I know you've made great strides within your organisation in creating that team, those digital clinical specialists worth their weight in gold. I've had the sort of, you know, the pleasure of working with most of them as a team, and also training like sort of some of them as well. And how have you found that journey, especially with coming into an organisation? You're in this new role, and there are egos, there are different characters, there are people that you have to contend with, and now all of a sudden it's like, I've got this immature clinical risk management system, if any, and I've got to now come in and sort of make that happen.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. So I think we've got a policy approved, so we're further along the journey than a lot of places. But what I would say is, what our challenge is now is bringing it to life. So really making sure that everyone knows their kind of roles, responsibilities, because we've described it, but now we need to go to that next level of, you know, what we've got: divisional patient safety leads, what's their role in it? We've got corporate patient safety teams, what's their role in it? What's the clinical lead's role in it? So I think it's now around actually applying it and holding firm on its importance, but you can't do that without a policy. So I think that being in place is absolutely the first thing. starting to think about how we educate further and wider around clinical safety. So not just, you know, at a project. Yes, at a project, if you're involved in the project, we need to talk to you about it and educate you about it. But actually, those business as usual quality safety roles, upskilling and educating them so that their kind of breadth of understanding increases. So that's kind of my, you know, that's the next bit for me. I think it's how do you do it? I think some of it is drawing on the benefits of, you know, how I've done it before and what that's given, whether it's your exec team, your senior leadership, in terms of that assurance. I think so. I came into digital healthcare. My first project, my first kind of baptism of fire was coming into program leader a recovery program, so a failed EPR implementation. So before that, I was working just in transformation. So I think, you know, as scary and as horrible that was, it's given me a really from the beginning, I've seen what happens when things go wrong. And actually I spent a lot of time understanding what had gone wrong and what needed to be put in place. And surprise, surprise, a lot of that was around process, was around training, was around risk assessment. So I think my journey, because I've done that first, my approach to things is through a kind of this is what could happen if it all goes wrong lens, which sounds dramatic, but actually if you've not experienced that, you know, a lot of people have implemented things. Oh, it's been fine. We've implemented it. It's been fine. So I think my approach and my kind of level of assurance and evidence requirement is a lot higher than a lot of other people. Through that recovery program, the organisation put in such stringent requirements for assurance. You know, our chief exec chaired the program board for the EPR implementation the next time we tried to do it, because the organisation had been so burnt. So I think because I've come at it that way, and then I've seen how actually embedding that ownership and that collaborative working actually leads to a better outcome. It's what the evidence and the paper says anyway. You know, if you look at any kind of academic evidence around adoption, embedding of digital tools, it all says the same thing. I've been able, Bristol knew it was a problem before I started. Like I said, some of the questions in my interview around it. So I think I've been able to kind of make those relationships with those key people to say, we need this, because how do you, chief nurse, have assurance around all of these things? And they didn't. So I think just constantly surfacing the information that you've got. And like you said before, we've got so much information. What are we doing with it? So how are we using it? How are we, you know, the safety quality spectrum is one spectrum, isn't it? So if we can do the safety assessment, we can improve quality, because we can ensure our standards are constantly getting better based on the evidence. So if you want to be the best, you need to at least start with safe, don't you?
No, absolutely, and it's really interesting to actually that sort of like journey. In the start of your journey, you couldn't have. It was probably a baptism of fire, like you said, but you couldn't have fallen into a better project to get that experience in relation to then coming into Bristol and Weston and saying, like, you know, it's that I've done this. I've seen the sort of like the hurdles, I've seen the sticking points, I've seen the sort of like, but also how positive as well to come into an organisation and actually, you know, that message is, like you've just said, that they understood the sort of, you know, that there was an issue. And I know, unbeknown to you and me, I was actually part of that sort of like that understanding through doing the sort of clinical risk management audit for Bristol and Weston, and then sort of and being involved in that, and then being able to, you know, being enabled to be able to sort of like move that forward in a positive fashion in what you've done. And I know off the back of that, we're working on a case study in relation to that. And I don't want to label it with sort of like governance, but sort of like it's around the journey, isn't it? And it's around that sort of like, you know, trying to get out there. And I think we'd both discussed, haven't we, and sort of trying to put our heads together to say, what can we do in relation to telling this story? And it is a good news story, and it is sort of like trying to get it out there. And I think both of us have seen, as we've been going on this journey, the sort of the ups and downs that other health organisations are having. And I think we've both said there must be something we can do to sort of like to get this out there. And I know already that very kindly, Leah, you and your team have allowed that clinical management system to be shared with other organisations as well. And you know, I'm still trying to get the feedback in relation to that. It's difficult at the moment, but it'd be great. I think it's absolutely priceless that we do get feedback into relation to that. And if we can get that case study out there, and dare I say, we put it in front of NHS England, that's my plan anyway. It would be absolutely fantastic if we could sort of get it to that level. But even if it, you know, it gets out there and it gives the message to other health organisations, and it gives them an approach and an appraisal of an approach that works in relation to that.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think it's starting from somewhere, isn't it? It's easier to start with someone else's than to start from scratch. I think there is something about, you know, it all comes back to the silos, doesn't it? And the culture of digital healthcare, because I think the NHS, you know, the minidisk type conversation is in this place where it now understands that it needs digital. Like, I think we're there, you know, about, you know, 5 to 10 years ago, people were still a bit, oh, nah, not for me, thanks.
What are we doing?
I think largely, you know, a few naysayers aside, people get it and they know that they need it. They don't know how to get there. And so there's still this kind of belief and philosophy that digital will just happen and then we'll just use it. And I think that is what this clinical risk management system is all about. You know, I love an analogy, but if you were going out to buy a car, you bought it from a dealership and a mechanic fixed it. If you then crashed it on a journey up to Scotland, you wouldn't blame the mechanic and you wouldn't blame the dealership. You're the person that has taken that tool and has used it to meet your needs and your requirements. And I think we're still at the point in healthcare where we're blaming the mechanics and the dealership, because actually what we haven't done is we haven't taken that ownership of that tool to say, we've bought something and we're going to embed it and we're going to use it to deliver our outcomes. And we're still reliant on, you know, I'll call digital teams the mechanics at the moment. And we think the risks should sit with them because they know what they're doing and they understand it. But actually it's us that's using it. And so we need to get around the table and we need to understand, you know, where are we driving? What's the route like? What's the terrain like? How long have I been driving? Am I experienced? It's going to rain. You know, all of that stuff is the same. It's the same, isn't it? It's how do you take a tool and use it within your service and really own that so that you get the best out of it. And I think that's what the clinical risk management system tries to do. It tries to break down that silo of it's just something that digital have turned on, created. It's how do we use it? And that's the important bit.
It is totally the important bit. And when you say sort of digital owning that risk, and around sort of like, you know, we've spoken sort of like previously on this episode around sort of like, you know, you're right, it's getting under the bonnet, isn't it? And it's asking all those questions, and that analogy is absolutely spot on, isn't it? You know, you don't walk out of your house getting into your car to know where you know where you're going.
You know, you've got to put petrol in it. You know, you've got to maintain it. You know, you've got to set your mirrors.
Absolutely, all that sort of stuff. But do you think there's sort of like, I know this was one of the pieces of work that we did with yourselves is around digital clinical safety fits under digital, and you know from my perspective, it's sort of like, and from my experience, that rings alarm bells, because, you know, not wanting to go on about all governance, but there has to, if that whole chain of command doesn't go down a clinical path and doesn't involve patient safety, then we're on a road to nowhere, aren't we, really? And we're going to get a good hiding on the way. And it's really interesting to try and see the roads that are being made, as you guys are doing it, and with patient safety. And I know from my experience that when you reach out to those people, a lot of them are saying, "Oh, what's clinical safety?" And, you know, and then we're on that journey again, aren't we, of raising awareness, that appreciation, and bringing people on. And it's small steps, isn't it? It's not sort of like going in all guns blazing and saying, "Why aren't we under patient safety?" But I think a big observation from my perspective is, and it'd be good to get your thoughts on this. And one of the reasons that spurred me on doing this piece of work with you guys is that digital clinical safety has been moved under patient safety within NHS England and within that team. And it would be really good if that, because that initiative has been taken at that national level, why hasn't that been cascaded down to health organisations? And why isn't that same message being supported within trusts and within sort of like, you know, primary care, within the sort of like the partnerships, the mental health community, etc., and stuff like that? Because there doesn't seem to be that support at that level.
Yeah. So I think in principle and in theory that makes sense. I think, you know, things like PISA that's just come out doesn't really talk about digital. So I think whilst they're under patient safety, they're kind of like neighbours at the moment. They're not fully integrated, which I would really welcome. You know, if we're talking about patient safety, let's talk about all of patient safety. I think for me, there's two different arms to clinical safety, isn't there? And I think what we've tried to do with the clinical risk management system is to keep those two tracks separate. So yes, the responsibility for kind of like the legislation, the adherence, if we're going live with something, have we done the due diligence around procurement, implementation, the program milestones, absolutely sits and reports up through digital. But what we have introduced is some governance groups. So we've got a digital safety steering group. And what that does is when a project creates a clinical safety output, that group will review that. And so that will then go up to patient safety. So the program governance of, have we done it? Have we ticked a box? Have we got authority to proceed, authority to release, whatever words you're familiar with? Are we okay to go? Goes through the digital governance. But actually the kind of the highlighting of what are the risks that we are now carrying reports up through patient safety, up to clinical quality group. So what that means is we've got dual reporting of digital governance and strategy going all up to the finance and digital committee, which is a sub-board committee. But the patient safety risks, you know, that conversation reports up to our clinical quality group and our quality and outcomes committee, because I think they are two different conversations. And I think the more we embed tools properly, the more that conversation becomes more apparent. And so I think I spend my life talking about this at the moment, because I think it is complex and people aren't clear on what goes where and why. But for me, if you're talking about patient safety and risks that the organisation needs to be aware of, we report up through patient safety, up to clinical quality group, through the arm that all other safety risks get discussed and all other quality conversations happening. If you're talking about adherence to legislation, preparation for a project, adherence to, you know, an annual requirement to review, then absolutely that comes through digital services in a governance legislative type monitoring fashion, because they are, whilst there's some overlap, they're different conversations fundamentally. And I think that's what the clinical risk management system really helps to kind of set out,
clarify, doesn't it, in that respect? And I think also, something to get out of that message as well, and the way that that's structured, because you're absolutely right, it is two different messages, two different conversations. However, we never want to be in the position, do we, moving forward, like we see quite a lot of the time, where it's like patient safety is sitting there saying, we never knew, nobody told us, or why haven't we been informed? If if it hits the proverbial fan, or there's something that needs to be sort of, that's the whole reason we have governance, isn't it? It's one of the reasons we have governance, isn't it? Because if stuff needs to happen, it needs to happen. If decisions need to be made, they need to be made. And it has to be at the right level. We can't just go, like we see a lot of the time, flailing around, sort of like, well, I've made that decision and we're sticking with it. It's like, sort of like, that needed to be made by someone else. So you're absolutely right. I mean, sort of, and I've found from my experience as well, working with other organisations, that patient safety are all for it. They're not sort of, whereas sometimes you'd sort of like, sometimes you get this, don't you, sort of like, oh no, we don't want to be involved in that and stay away and just arm's length. It's been absolutely embraced everywhere I've been. They're like, yeah, absolutely. And they totally agree. We totally need to be part of this.
I think certainly my experience here has been they felt a bit blind before. So, they're still the ones that are dealing with, God forbid, incidents happen, they're still dealing with it.
Yeah,
and yet totally. They haven't necessarily had that involvement and that understanding throughout the process. So that's why, I absolutely try and get one of the corporate team into any of the work streams so that they can just listen, hear the conversation. And then there's almost that kind of handover to BAU at the go live point, or after the post implementation kind of phase, that says, right, now the system's live, you guys are managing the risks, but if anything crops up, we've agreed what the risks are, we've agreed how we're mitigating them, but if anything crops up, you absolutely do a datex, we'll get sight of it, and then we get to and it's that feedback loop, isn't it, of now we're using it, how are we monitoring what things come up. And I think certainly at Bristol, historically, people didn't necessarily datex clinical system things because they didn't, either nothing happened as a result of it, or they didn't really understand that was an option. So unless it was a bit more of a complex multifactorial incident, we're not, things like not being able to log in to a system, or OBS being calculated wrong, that is an incident. And whether, there's still a human in that chain. And I always say there will always be a human in that chain, because actually what the system is trying to do is to guide you and to provide you with the information that you need. But if you as a human don't think it's right, you can override that and you can still address that. And that's where you'd have to raise that incident. And so I think where we're now doing that education is with those teams to say, report it through, note it as a clinical system thing. So it comes back to us, because then at that point, on an annual basis, because that's what the legislation says, where possible, it's hard. It's a lot of resource. We've got nearly 300 systems. We aren't compliant with the full legislation for a lot of them, but we've got some risks on the risk register that says that, because they're historic, they're old. Anything new moving forward will. But I think what we want to do is close that loop. So on an annual basis, we're saying, right, what incident would come in relating to that system? What are the themes? Do we need to change our education? Do we need to raise anything with the supplier? That's very much not just about we want to do something differently. And I think going back to what we were talking about earlier, the NHS is terrible at process variation and thinking we're special. And so I do feel, I give suppliers their stick, don't get me wrong, but I do feel for them in that if they're looking after like 10 different trusts, every trust will want something a slightly different way.
Something different.
And so there is something around that principle of, if you're taking a system, this is how we recommend you use it, and you tweak your process to do that. Because actually what that does do is it means that we reduce the noise of the request. And so when we get together, like you said, through user groups or whatever fashion it is, to say, actually, we've noticed something that if you changed it, it would be really helpful, because either it's a safety issue or it would just be a really powerful UX change. There's a really good example of one, and I won't name the system, but you open up a clinical note and to close it, you click cancel. Now, that's quite common terminology in systems. cancel
Yeah.
because I'm just shutting it down. But the feedback from the shop floor is we're really nervous about cancelling it because we don't want to cancel it. And so
close.
if you've requested 25,000, we just want to do it a bit differently, changes, that one nugget of gold gets lost, doesn't it? Whereas actually, if you as an organisation can use your clinical risk management process to really hone in on what are the 3 or 4 really important change requests that we think would really make a difference, galvanise some support through fellow users, you're far more likely to get them implemented across the board.
You are. Yeah,
so
you are.
I think there's something there around picking what you ask for sure. And then so the narrative is then you're going to need to change your processes a bit.
And I'm hoping that as we move forward, because we're still not a digitally mature workforce, within nowhere near. But I'm hoping with initiatives that hopefully will be put in place and that grows, that people will start asking the right questions, Leah. And also, I think it'd be really interesting to be able to do some stats around how many people actually see issues but don't raise them. Because when we look at stats, it's all well and good us looking at stats and saying, oh, there was only X amount of issues raised, so there can't be any issues with the system. And it's like, well, hang on a second.
That's why getting out on the shop floor is important, though, as well, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And actually seeing what it's like, seeing how it is, what's the actual experience. Because people get bored of reporting things, don't they? Or they just get immune to it and just click off. Or
and this is me imploring sort of like to the wider audience, like sort of if you're going to employ into sort of CxIO or digital clinical specialist roles, please don't make them 4 days a week working from home. because it won't work. It doesn't work. Those people need to be out there. They need to be on the shop floor, and they need to be known. People need to know who you are and what you do, and you also need to be out there knowing sort of like what's going on. And like you say, you need to be out there walking the floor sometimes and actually looking at what the experiences are and that people are having in relation to that.
And if your kind of formal feedback mechanism isn't working, or you think there's some holes in it, what are you doing informally? We've got digital champions, different people have different mechanisms, but how are you making that information useful? Because I do think the UX side of healthcare suppliers compared to think of other big commercial companies, our colleagues are expecting that level of interface and that level of UX, and it's not there. So how can we galvanize, like I said, those nuggets of gold, share with our users, and then help suppliers by saying, we're users, we can help you. You might not have a massive UX budget, but use your user group to help if you're using the clinical safety process and you're using your feedback to help prioritize some of those requests, then actually chances are you're gonna have some really good intelligence in there.
It's improving collaboration, isn't it? It's that relationship between suppliers and help organisations.
Don't just tell me it's working as designed, because that phrase really gets my goat. Because it might be working as designed.
Yeah.
But there's still a problem. Yeah.
There still is. No, absolutely. Leah, we could go on. We could go on for forever talking about sort of some of the our experiences and how we could sort of change the world. It's been absolutely lovely having you on. But I will ask you if there's one, I'm putting you on the spot now, if there's one takeaway that you could sort of that you could give to everyone in relation to sort of like your experience, digital health projects, in relation to clinical risk management and safety piece, what would that be?
It would be that, for me, digital clinical safety, digital competence, digital skills as a workforce topic it is as important for a nurse, AHP, midwife, doctor to be digitally competent in today's world as it is for them to be able to dress a wound, prescribe, any of those other safety type, metrics. Being digitally competent and understanding how to use systems and that flow of digital kind of information is as important as that. So outside of implementations and the robust kind of clinical safety, how are we supporting our workforce on a wider, more generic scale to be not just competent but confident? Because it's here to stay. Are we doing business continuity fire drills once, twice a year? Are people getting regular updates on digital working? It's the culture change for me. It's here to stay. It's not going anywhere. If anything, we're going to get more and more dependent on really getting the most out of digital skills. So how do we embed it in everything we do?
Couldn't agree more, Leah. And I think with that means, it's here to stay, and the risk will be more and more risk. So we have to be alert. We have to be on the money, and we have to manage them effectively. Leah, thank you ever so much for your time. Thank you for joining us on The Only Way is Ethics, episode 6. And we will definitely catch up again. For everyone out there, yes, you can find us on Spotify and YouTube. So please subscribe to our channels. And again, thank you, Leah, ever so much.
You're very welcome.